So Yaakov, we're going to start with you and your new book. The book tells the story of how Israel developed its weapons industry, and the process not just changed how Israel fights its adversaries in the Middle East, but changed how the world fights today. Whether it's with drones, targeted killings, and various systems that can intercept anti-tank missiles. So my question for you, sort of in the vein of the New York Times book review today, whose headline was, "How did David become Goliath?" Please tell us a little bit of that backstory. How did this transformation happen?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Dina, and thank you, Ambassador Danon, and thanks to everyone for coming, and to the 92nd Y, and to the St. Martin's Press people who are also here, the publisher of the book. I appreciate it. I think that the story is one of a tale of a people who, against all odds, achieved the amazing, and that is the ability to a historic and ancient people to return to their historic homeland and to establish a nation and a country and a state against all odds. And here you have Israel without any resources, no oil, no minerals, no way to make money, but only had one real resource, and that was the Jewish brain, the brain of the people who came to the country back in those waves of aliyah, of immigration, just before the state was created and after the state was created in 1948. And I think that the real, what we came to find when researching this book and looking at how is it that Israel has created the most amazing defense technology. So we're all familiar, let's say, with Iron Dome, which can shoot down and intercept short-range rockets, or the Arrow, which can intercept long-range ballistic missiles from places like Iran, and how we were the first to come up with the idea for drones. I think that when you have your back up against the wall, you have no choice but to innovate, but to be creative. There was one line that Chaim Eshed, who was the man who we write about in the book, who came up with the idea for Israel to build its first satellite back in the 1970s, when only 7 countries had satellites, major superpowers, the Soviets, the Americans, the Chinese, and he thought that little Israel could do it. And he told me once, the shadow of the guillotine sharpens the mind. And I think that at the end of the day, that kind of encompasses the story here. It's one of, if you don't innovate, you don't survive. And that's where it all came to play.
But now that Israel is a superpower in the region and a weapons master, do you think Israelis have internalized their own power? Do they understand their strengths? How does that play out?
I think that to some extent they do, and sometimes maybe they don't. But as we've seen in recent conflicts, right, which some of them have been controversial in Israel's use of its military force and its power, I think that Israel finds itself sometimes in a complex crossroads of how, on the one hand, can it use its technology and its conventional military capabilities when fighting against terrorist organizations in an asymmetric conflict, right? So you have a Palestinian terrorist organization which embeds itself in civilian infrastructure, so a home or a hospital or a school, and fires rockets at you, and you have your F-16. So when you look at the playing field, it seems imbalanced, right? Israel's got the F-16 and the Hellfire missile, and it's got the drones and the Merkava tank and everything, and all these guys have, it seems, is a Qassam rocket or a Katyusha rocket being fired from a schoolyard. So how do you explain the discrepancy? And I think that, as we've seen, and we write about this also in the book, is Israel's also tried to create innovative tactics. And some of them, for example, just one is what they called knocking on the roof. So in a Gaza operation back in 2008, 2009, Cast Lead, Israel, what it did was it collected all of the phone numbers of a lot of the homes in Gaza, even cell phone numbers. And when it found out that, let's say, home X had an arms cache in the basement, it wanted to bomb the home. So it would call the home, and it would say, you guys got 5 minutes to get out. And then most of the time they left. But on the 45th or 50th time, I don't remember, the people didn't leave the home. They went up to the roof, and they knew there was a drone up above transmitting images back to headquarters in Tel Aviv. And they just waved up at the drone, so they didn't know what to do. Next day, they call the home again. And again, they go up on the roof. So they came up with this idea to fire a non-lethal bomb into the corner of that roof and literally knock on the roof. And that scared the people, and they fled the home, and then they bombed the home. So you see to the great distances to what Israel does to try to save lives, the combination of advanced technology, of superior intelligence, with innovative tactics aimed, I think, at trying to retain a sense of morality and military ethics.
You mentioned in the book the issue of international legitimacy. So how does Israel navigate that terrain?
Well, not easily, right? But I think that on the one hand, you have to believe that what you're doing is right. But you can't ignore the fact, and Ambassador Danon could probably talk about this just as well, if not better, is the idea of you have to have, I think what we find is that you have to have the international legitimacy to attack. You have to have the backing of your allies and of the world, because if you don't have that, then you won't be able to continue. And when you look at some of the Israeli conflicts over the years, whether it was the Second Lebanon War in 2006, so there was an incident in the middle of July that a bomb went off near a home in a village called Kfar Kana. And it was a bomb that was dropped the night before. It didn't explode, then exploded. The initial report spoke about dozens who were killed. But only later in the day did Israel release a video that showed that rockets had been fired from that building, which made it a legitimate military target. That same day, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice happened to be in Israel doing shuttle diplomacy. And she was very upset. Beirut told her, don't bother coming to us. And she got Olmert, then the prime minister, to give in to a 48-hour suspension of aerial activity. So if you don't have international support, that will hinder your ability to act.
And one of the chapters I found most interesting was about drones. And like all of your chapters, you do a really good job of drawing out the characters. All of these weapons seem like nameless, faceless weapons, but there are people behind them. Usually one sort of scrappy person in particular who has a story. Can you tell us a little bit about the drone story, how that came to be and how the Americans came to take it on themselves?
The drone story, I think, is the most fascinating of the stories. It's one of, I take you back to 1968, so we're just after the Six-Day War, which was in 1967. Israel doubles or triples in size. We conquered the Sinai Peninsula. And Israel's on one side of the Suez Canal, the Egyptians are on the other side. And Israel just wants to know what's happening just over the Suez. Are the Egyptians preparing for war again? So they try to fly aircraft. They can't fly over Egypt, so they fly on an angle from high altitudes. The pictures are no good. They can't really see anything. They build these towers on top of tanks until one day Egyptian soldiers start to fire snipers. Guy gets shot. They say they can't do that either. And then they just don't know what to do. So there was this one intelligence officer who they sent to Europe, from Europe to Cairo. Cairo drives up to the Suez, takes some photos, goes back to Cairo, flies back to Europe, back to Israel. And then they take the photos, right? And they look at them and they're, oh my God, they actually have military vehicles there. And there was one officer that day who was in the headquarters of military intelligence who said, this is insane. I mean, we're sending spies in a crisscross way to just find out what's happening 30 meters across the Suez. And he remembered that he had seen a movie. It's that ridiculous. He had seen a movie about a Jewish kid in America who got a toy airplane as a gift. And he remembered that they came in different colors, different sizes, remote control. Make a long story short, here in New York, they bought 3 toy airplanes, sent them back to Israel in the diplomatic pouch, attached cameras to their bellies, and flew them over the Suez. And we actually have some photos of those first, inside the book, of those first images they took over the Suez. But that was what started, that was the first drone that was flown in the world.
Right.
Fast forward to the 1980s, America doesn't have any drones. They realize they need them. Where do they go? They come to Israel and they buy Israeli drones.
Right. So you have amazing access in this book. You take us deep into the corridors of where decisions are being made, whether it's about drones or the birth of the satellite program, whether it's down underground during Gaza incursions. Can you talk a little bit about, as a journalist, what defense reporters, the access that defense reporters in Israel have, and how that can be a blessing, but how that can also be a challenge in terms of sort of distance from what's going on?
You have access, and I found that in 15 years or so of being a journalist in Israel, a lot of it depends on your ability to establish relationships with people, for them to confide in you, and you know this as well. But I think that when it comes to the defense issue or that sector, because it's sensitive and because Israel lives with real credible threats on a daily basis, we have a military censor in Israel, right? So on the one hand, that's a gift because people can speak openly with you and share with you secrets because they know that your story has to be approved by the censor. So they can give you much more than you can publish. But what good does that do if I just keep it in my head? But the stories here were, what we discovered were, there were these people whose stories had never been told. The guy who pushed through the satellites, this Shabtai Brill who came up with the toy airplane idea, the Talik who came up with the idea for the Merkava, people whose stories hadn't been told. And it was less about the weapons, it was more about this culture of innovation and of survival that we found to be most amazing and was a story that had yet to be told about Israel.
Ambassador Danon, can you talk a little bit about that culture of innovation in Israel? You were formerly with this Ministry of Science and Technology. how does that play out, that Israeli culture? And also now that you've been ambassador to the UN, what kind of interest are you finding from other countries in Israel's weapons program?
Good afternoon, shalom. I'm very happy to be here. Yaakov, congratulations.
Thank you.
On the new book. I told my son I'm coming to the Y. He told me, but it's Super Bowl night. Nobody will show up. And I'm very happy to see that he was wrong about that. Being the former Minister of Science and Technology, I can tell you that we're very proud of the innovation spirit that we have in Israel. And being at the UN more than a year, people want to know more about Israel. And one of the things I found amazing at the UN is the gap between the public UN, which you all know about, which is a disgrace, shameful, to the private aspects. And privately, people come to me, they meet with me, and they want to know more about Israel. I took with me 2 delegations of ambassadors to Israel, and we tried to pack 3,000 years of history within 4 days. Mission impossible. So, you know, me and Yaakov, you met one of the delegation. We took them with a helicopter to see the Gaza Strip. We flew to the Golan Heights, Judea and Samaria. At the end of the trip, I asked them, what was most important to you? I was sure they would tell me we met, you know, the head of the prime minister, we met Yaakov Katz, we saw the helicopter ride on the Golan Heights, but they like the small things which are connected to innovation and technology. We visited a desalination factory in Ashkelon, and for them it was amazing to actually go inside and understand how we do that. And the same factory, by the way, sells the technology today to California and other regions here in the US. And then we visited next to the city of Rehovot. There is an agriculture center where they actually learned about the Israeli mango, which is a delicious mango. And they told us we want to bring the mango back to our countries. So we tend to think that usually it's the big issues of security and defense, but for many, many of the ambassadors, it's the small issues which are very important to them in terms of technology and innovation. And I think that today, and we also read about it in the book, when you think about technology that you develop, it goes to places you cannot imagine.
Right.
So when you develop one thing, for example, today we are busy about finding a solution to the tunnels, which is a major threat in terms of terrorism in Israel. I don't know what will be the use of that technology, but I can assure you it will not be for detecting tunnels of Hamas. But people in New York City will use that technology in 15, 20, 50 years. So I think that is very important. And I want to end this part with a story about when I was the Minister of Science and Technology. I hosted a mission from China. And they came to see me in my office in Jerusalem, and they told me, Minister Danon, we want to buy Israeli technology. And I told them, that's amazing, but can you please be more specific about it? You want to cybersecurity, biomed, you know, defense system. They told me, we don't care. Whatever is Jewish, we want to buy. Right. So I think the book is very important because sometimes people feel that, you know, whatever we do in Israel is great, it's important, without really understanding why. And I think in the book you get the real examples about what we do, especially in the defense ministry, and how it can help take the issue of the drones, for example.
Right.
Today we sell, without getting into details, we sell drones to the UN. And it's being used for several things that the UN needs to do. So for us, it allows us actually to develop relationship with the UN and not only to defend our people.
Right. Is it 60% of drone sales?
Israel has a market share of about 60% of drone sales around the world, and it brings in what started with those toy airplanes on the Suez back in the 60s, has turned into about $1 billion plus of exports into money into the Israeli economy on an annual basis. And just about the drones, as Ambassador Danon spoke about, so one of the stories that we reveal here, which had never been told before, was back after the 2008 war that Russia fought with Georgia and South Ossetia. The Georgians had Israeli drones, and the Russians, even though they won that war, and they shot down a few of the Georgians' drones, they didn't have drones. Their drones were late to come to the battlefield. They didn't operate. They didn't function correctly. They came to Israel after the war. We want to buy Israeli drones. Russia had never bought any foreign defense technology until then. Everything was made inside Russia. It was the first time they had come. Now, Israel sell to the Russians. We've seen how Russian technology made its way to Lebanon, to Hezbollah. We've seen how Russian technology is used by Syria, by Iran. It was a whole big disagreement within the defense ministry and the foreign ministry and the prime minister's office. It went up to the cabinet. the inner security cabinet. In the end, Israel ended up selling them drones, but they were older generation drones, but it was a quid pro quo. Then Russia was supposed to deliver an advanced missile defense system called the S-300, one of the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world, to the Iranians. And very quietly, and people won't admit it even today, but Israel gave them those drones, and that delivery of that missile system was delayed by about 5 years. So you see how weapon systems in these relationships can actually give you also diplomatic maneuverability.
I mean, you mentioned, Ambassador Danon, that there's sometimes unexpected consequences to technology, or technology built on technology. So one of those areas is targeted assassinations or targeted killings with the help of drones. So one of the, you quote a Shabak head in the book that says, you know, this is not an eye for an eye, but it's having him for lunch before he has you for dinner. So there's this idea of this is, you know, a short-term strategy, but how does technology and political strategy go together? Because these might have short-term consequences or short-term effects, but you know, you also write in your book that a power vacuum does not last long, as we know, especially in Gaza and the West Bank. So where again does the military and the government sort of coordinate on that versus long-term strategy versus short-term strategy?
Well, I think, you know, there is, on the one hand, the devil you know sometimes is better than the devil you don't know. So if you're thinking about taking out, let's say, the head of Hamas, who comes and replaces him? If you kill or assassinate Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, who comes tomorrow? So sometimes when you can calculate these people and you can analyze what they might do, it might be better to actually keep them as bad as they might be. So there is long-term strategy. When the targeted killings that Israel has really honed and turned into a well-oiled machine, if we could call it that, but has really become I'd say the standard today in the war on terrorism. You see that it's being used by the United States.
Right.
As much as there's criticism of the former President Obama and his disengagement, let's say, from the Middle East, he used drone strikes more than any other president in the past. So he also understood the importance of that tool. But I think that on the one hand, you can use it for short-term gains, mostly at times of conflict, but it's also something that gives you the ability to strike with precision intelligence, precision munitions. It gives you long-term plus short-term gain.
Right, right. Speaking of politics, as we are all in this room sort of obsessed with what's been going on since Donald Trump's victory, and there's an assumption that among Israelis, Trump is good for Israel. Would you say, Ambassador Danon, that it's true that Trump is that the conventional wisdom among Netanyahu and his government that Trump is good for Israel?
No, we have enough politics in Jerusalem. So you with your own issues. I have been in the U.S. many times, and usually people came to me and told me, listen, we have a device for the Israelis to change your electorate system. So after being here for a year and I saw your election system, I don't think I will take any advices from you about amending our system. The relationship between Israel and the U.S. are very good, no matter who is the president. And I know that being in the Ministry of Defense, we work together. I do agree with you that people in Israel liked the element of surprise, that the media was wrong. Same happened in Israel. The media said that Bougie Herzog will win the elections, and in the city of Tel Aviv, people felt that the Likud will lose and Prime Minister Netanyahu will not win the elections, and then there was the element of surprise. So I think people in Israel, when they saw what happened here, they also shared the element of surprise that, the media lost. But it's not, I cannot tell you that, they supported Hillary or Trump. We followed the election. We appreciate the process. Being at the UN, I look at my colleagues, most of them do not know what it means to run for office or to have primaries or to have elections. So I think we all should appreciate the fact that we are strong democracies. Right,
but currently we have fair to say, you said surprise, an unpredictable American president. And there are certain challenges there. Even when you have the Australians, arguably the closest allies to America, aside from the British and perhaps Canadians, being berated on the telephone. And you have there was a report that really struck me from before the inauguration, where U.S. officials told Israelis not to share intelligence on Iran because they didn't want that information passed on to Russia by Trump. So we're really in uncharted waters here. I'm curious from both of you. Does that unpredictability, is that good for Israel? Is that bad for Israel? And we know that foreign leaders are walking a very delicate line right now, because you can't totally anger the Americans, but they also have their people back home that are upset with them. For example, Theresa May is facing mass protests in the streets about her invitation to Trump for a state visit. So could you talk a little bit to that?
I see an opportunity for Israel, speaking about the UN, because we have a new Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who was the former Prime Minister of Portugal. We have a new administration in Washington. So for us, it's an opportunity to try to change the UN. When I speak about anti-Semitism at the UN, the obsession with Israel, the number of resolutions. In the last 10 years, there were more than 250 resolutions condemning Israel, compared to 8 resolutions condemning what's happening in Syria. So for us, and I met Ambassador Haley only last Friday, and I told her, we have an opportunity now, when you have a new ambassador, a new president, maybe to demand more from the UN and to see some changes. So for us, the fact that we have a new Secretary General and a new president, we will try to change what's happening at the UN.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I can give a little more of an undiplomatic response. No, I think that within Israel, there was a sentiment during the election, and even after, especially after President Trump was elected, especially by the far right in the settler camp, that this would be different. And it was based on remarks and statements that had been made, especially by advisors that surrounded the president during the election campaign, that settlements are not an obstacle to peace, language that Israel had not heard for years, right? And go back to Prime Minister Netanyahu's first visit to President Obama back in July of 2008, where he was ambushed in the Oval Office with this idea of a settlement freeze, where he didn't see coming, and how the settlements had always been, for 8 years, it was this rocky relationship about the settlements, and it all came to, as Ambassador Danon knows better than all of us, to the resolution 2334, which passed just a few weeks ago. So I think that within Israel, there's this anticipation that this will be a different administration. I can tell you just one personal experience from this last Thursday night. Right. So I was at the newspaper in Jerusalem, at the Jerusalem Post. We were closing. Friday's our big weekend paper in Israel. And at about 9 o'clock, I had a phone call from our Washington correspondent that he has an official statement from the administration about settlements. Now, I'll remind you that in the previous week, Israel had announced a number of new housing construction in settlements, several thousand here, several thousand there, things that had not been done under President Obama. And the Trump administration remained quiet, silence, which was something that was new for Israel, not to be condemned. Right. So my correspondent in Washington was going after the administration to try to see, guys, say something, like, what do you have to say? And they were absolutely quiet. Until Thursday night, I got the phone call, Yaakov, I have an official statement from the White House. And it came to us, and we looked at it. It had been sent by email, so it wasn't like he spoke to some random guy. It was sent by one official, and 2 other officials were CC'd on this email. And it was a statement which called on Israel to stop the announcements. It was undermining the process and the policy of the president. The president affirms his commitment to a 2-state solution, to negotiating a peace deal, and all of this is not helpful.
And to stop building these.
And to stop announcing. It wasn't stop building, stop announcing, and stop new settlements. This went live at about 11 o'clock our time, so that's 4 p.m. here, and spread like wildfire, went crazy because it was the first time that the administration made a comment about the settlements. And then 2 hours later, Sean Spicer, who's the press secretary, issued an official statement, which was much more toned down, watered down, a totally different statement than had been given to us. So people said, obviously we were the first attack against us was fake news, right? The Jerusalem Post is fake news, which I took with love. But what really happened was the fact that you had, I think, and I don't know, right? To be honest, I don't know the backstory here. I don't know everything that happened, but it seems that the administration might be still getting its footing exactly where it wants to be, what it wants to be saying about these issues, and they're very complicated. And I don't know that there yet is a set, clear policy. So for everyone who's celebrating still in Israel, I think that might be premature. I think that we need to give some time still for the administration to set policy, and we have a visit. Next week, Prime Minister Netanyahu will be meeting with the president, and I think that will be the starting point for us to understand what the new what the policies will be.
Right. For both of you, a question. What do you and also Ambassador Danon, what do you think about this theory that Netanyahu himself may have asked the White House to issue that statement to the Jerusalem Post?
Well, I think in the next 4 years, you're going to have a lot of theories. So we care about the actions. And as Yaakov mentioned, the Prime Minister is coming. It's an important visit. It will be the first official visit of a leader of the Middle East in the White House. And it speaks for itself that the president will meet the prime minister first. You know, with President Obama, it was not the case. So remember that he traveled to the Middle East. He visited other countries, and he skipped Israel. And for us, many Israelis were insulted by that. So it looks different. There are serious issues on the table. It will be one part of the discussion, but not only. We have the issue of Iran, what's happening in Syria. We have other regional things that we need to discuss with the president. And also we will discuss the peace process. And basically we will tell what we told the previous administration. Don't blame Israel for everything. The other side is not willing to condemn terrorism, is not willing to negotiate with Israelis. We saw the horrible attack that happened in Jerusalem a few weeks ago. Until today, no one in the Palestinian Authority condemned that attack. So I think the president will hear it from the prime minister, and I think it will not be the only meeting. There will be many more meetings. And if I can be an advisor for a minute for the president, I will advise him to come to Israel, to come to Jerusalem. It will be very important for us.
What do you expect from this meeting?
Well, I don't buy into, I'm not a big believer of conspiracy theories. I think that sometimes we give that a little too much credit to think that the prime minister called up the president and said, hey, could you issue a statement and leak it to the Jerusalem Post? And then, well, I mean, like it's way too complicated. I think it's just more, can explain that there's different competing forces currently within the Oval Office, and they're trying to get their footing. But I will say, and as the ambassador, we ran a story recently that detailed the Palestinian support for terrorists and their families. And you're looking at about 1 billion shekel a year annually that goes to the families of martyrs, right, of people who have carried out terrorist attacks, and to terrorists who are currently in Israeli prisons. So when you talk about the possibility of restarting a peace process with someone who, by the way, hasn't been elected in over 10 years, right, if not more, a president who still is a president with what exactly mandate, I don't know, but then to talk about well, who's at fault here when you have a culture of incitement and hatred and violence, it's very complicated, although I think there are ways to step forward. So I think that what we might see in our predictions is maybe a type of a new resurgence of the 2004 Bush letter. There was a letter that President Bush gave Ariel Sharon back in 2004, which basically said, we're committed to a two-state solution, but Israel has the right to build within settlement blocks. And if you look at the recent press secretary statement, which spoke about building within borders of settlements, that seem to hint towards that type of kind of new environment. So I think we'll see that, but as Ambassador Danon mentioned, there's many other issues here that need to be dealt with. I mean, the Syria fighting, Iran, which is still, you know, just with their ballistic missile test the other day, there's a lot of other issues on the table beyond just the Palestinians.
And those will also be coming up at this meeting.
I think 100%.
Right. But to the settlement issue, with Israel announcing its plans to build 5,500 new housing units. The Palestinians say, look, this is more proof that Israel is not serious. You know, if we really want to have a two-state solution, we can't be having more settlements. And if Israel does absorb into the West Bank with 2 million Palestinians, you don't have a Jewish and democratic state. So what is the bigger existential threat here, Ambassador Danon? Is it really giving up the two-state solution? And how can Netanyahu keep talking about the two-state solution but keep doing things that seem to be against it?
Well, first I have to be very clear about it because I hear it a lot, that the threat, and I think what you said, it's a threat that we hear a lot, that if Israel will not agree to all of the demands of the Palestinians immediately and will not sign the agreement today, there will be a one-state solution. And I hear it a lot here in the US. And as far as I'm concerned, and most of the Israelis concerned, it is not the case. Most of the Israelis, even those who are on the right, do not believe in the idea of a one-state solution, of annexing all of the Palestinians in the cities in Judea and Samaria, and the people in Gaza. It is not the case. It is a lie. You call it fake news, or maybe it is not the case. What we say, that we're willing to negotiate. Our goal, that the Jews and Arabs will live together. Also in Judea and Samaria. The same way that today you have Arab Israelis who live in Haifa and in Ramle and in many cities within Israel. Nobody ever, there were some in the Knesset that are not there anymore, but nobody ever actually is calling now to expel them from Israel. So I think in the future, when we will get to the point to negotiate, I don't see a reason. When I took the ambassadors and to Ma'ale Adumim, and told them why Ma'ale Adumim cannot stay here. Why? What's the problem? And if there would be another Ma'ale Adumim between here and the Dead Sea, it will be a problem. On the contrary, it will allow more Palestinians to work, like they work here in the industrial zone in Ma'ale Adumim. So I think that we should make it clear that the settlements are not the real problem. We can negotiate, and for us, one day we can have peace with Jews and Arabs that live together the same way that we do in Israel today.
But the Palestinians say they cannot have a state if there are settlements continually being built on their land. So, and if there is de facto no agreement, it will become de facto one state if there's not a negotiated peace deal.
Well, I think most of the people here are very knowledgeable, and we know that it's not true that the settlements are actually, we're taking land from the Palestinians. Most of the land in Judea and Samaria is vacant. You don't have Jews, you don't have Arabs, it's vacant land, it's not developed. And I think there is a space for Jews and Arabs to build new cities, like you have Wabi in one hand, next to Ramallah, and you have Ma'ale Adumim on the other end. And I think for the Palestinians, it's an excuse not to actually negotiate with us. And we proved in the past, Menachem Begin negotiated with Egypt a peace agreement. We negotiated with Jordan a peace agreement. We are capable of negotiating, but for them, they don't want to come to our room and to negotiate with us. They prefer to come to the Security Council, to go to France to have another conference, and not to sit down and negotiate with us. It's much easier for them to blame the settlements for everything rather than to sit down and negotiate with us.
So you don't see settlements as any kind of obstacle?
Absolutely not.
And what about you mentioned the internationalization of the conflict with the Palestinians returning again and again to the United Nations. Do you see that trend continuing? I'm curious what you both have to say about that.
Well, President Abbas spoke at the General Assembly last September, and he said it clearly. Our goal is to come to the international community, and today they are doing that, coming to the Security Council. They try to enter other international organizations. But the problem is that when they enter the organizations, they don't promote the cause of the Palestinian people. They come to those organizations, and the first thing they do is to attack Israel and to use this organization to pass resolutions against Israel. So, and I think that the new administration will have to look into that as well, because getting the credit from the international community without even negotiating with Israel, I think it is something which you should not expect and accept from them. And for us, negotiation is the key, because when I see the conference in France, when you have 70 leaders coming to speak in Europe, and you don't have the Israelis and the Palestinians in the same room, so what you're going to gain out of it? So let's say Abu Mazen will be successful, and in a year they will enter another 50 international organizations. So what? It will help the Palestinians on the ground? It will not help them.
Look, I think that you have a situation of where the internationalization of the conflict serves their interest of trying to delegitimize Israel ultimately, right? Or push Israel into a corner that then Israel will be forced, and its hand will be forced by the international community to make concessions and to do things. But what's insane in my eyes, right, is, and I have my criticism of Netanyahu, you can read our editorials, quite often we are critical of we think that he could do more towards getting President Abbas to come and sit down with him. But Ramallah to Jerusalem is a 15, 20-minute drive. I do it every so often, right? We go to the Muqata where President Abbas sits, and we meet there with officials. But the fact that the two of them can't get together, right? The fact that President Abbas won't meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu, despite it being invited, I think, from just recently at the UN General Assembly, if not even since then, talks to this, I think, maybe his fear, his inability, or incompetence to want to really reach a peace deal with Israel, right? I'm not sure how much he, in his current capacity, he's now 80 years old, he's not necessarily thinking about what will be for the Palestinian people, but maybe just will be for him, and he's afraid to have to make those serious concessions. And I take you back to 2008. Prime Minister Olmert made him a very generous offer that I think no Prime Minister of Israel could ever do better than, right? 97+% of the territory, and he said no to that at the end of the day.
But Netanyahu is also hamstrung himself with a very right-wing government, and there's a sense that he also cannot make the concessions perhaps that he would want because of his own government. I think,
right, so that I would say that my criticism of Netanyahu is that we see a lot of political posturing and a lot of political playing, right? Netanyahu would want maybe to do, and I think that he genuinely, from the conversations that we've had with him, would really want to try to maybe achieve a peace deal with the Palestinians. I think he sees this as a historic opportunity. But on the one hand, he looks to his right and he sees ministers like Bennett and Naftali Bennett. He sees parties that they are potentially going to eat away at his base constituency, which is the right-wing camp within Israel. And he's afraid how much can he maneuver that way. So Bennett says we have to pass a very controversial settlement bill. Netanyahu also has to vote in favor because otherwise he'll be left-wing. Bennett says we have to make a deal with Amona, which, by the way, you talk about, as the ambassador said, Israel's willingness how Israel doesn't build on Palestinian land. Just this past week, Israel demolished a outpost that had been built on private Palestinian land.
After being court ordered.
Well, after being court ordered, yes, but a rule of law does exist within Israel.
Right. I'd like to switch a little bit to bipartisan support of Israel. Traditionally, the pro-Israel community, the mantra was bipartisan support, and this may be collapsing, especially after 8 years of Netanyahu and Obama tensions. How does one salvage that? And is there a concern that, as things become more and more partisan and the issue of Israel becomes more of a Republican topic, that Hillary Rodham Clinton might be the last Democratic presidential contender to actually be pro-Israel?
That's for me or for the ambassador?
I'll start with the ambassador.
First, we all agree that we need a bipartisan support. It will be bad for Israel if it will be only one party that will support Israel. We saw what happened at the UN on December 23rd when, unfortunately, the previous president decided not to veto the shameful one-sided resolution that passed in the Security Council. Before the vote, I believe there were almost 80 senators from both parties that signed a letter to the president calling him to veto
But why
the
was
resolution.
it shameful? This is the same position that international leaders and Americans have had for 50 years.
I use harsh words, and I will continue. It was a shameful resolution and a shameful moment. The fact that we were abandoned at the Security Council in the United Nations, because when you read the language of the resolution, by the way, there was no engagement. Usually when you have a resolution concerning Israel, there is engagement about the resolution. Nobody engaged with us about the language of the resolution. And when you read the resolution, which says that the presence of Jews in Jerusalem, in the Jewish quarter, in the Wailing Wall, is illegal, for me it's shameful. And I would expect the US and all of the other countries, by the way, who sat on that room and say that we support Israel, not to allow such a one-sided resolution to pass at the Security Council.
But again, it's a non-binding resolution, and it says that settlements are a detriment to peace, or stumbling blocks to peace, and that is what America's been saying, and the international community has been saying
much
for 50
more.
years.
And if you read Article 5 of the resolution, it calls to boycott anyone who actually work with companies within Judea, Samaria, and East Jerusalem. So if you have, Dina, if you have a store today in Gilo or in Ramat Shlomo, according to the resolution, you should be boycotted. It is a shameful resolution, and it was drafted by the Palestinians, and unfortunately, the previous president decided to support and to allow this resolution to pass. I think it was a mistake and also when I speak with my friends, not from the Republican Party, they agree with me that they wish it was a different scenario. So I think for Israel, we will continue to build relations with all parties here in the US. It is very important for us. I was in DC last week and I met also Republican and Democrats, and for us it is crucial, and we will do our best to make sure that it will not be an issue that involves only the Republican Party.
Look, but I think that Israel has a very big problem right now when it comes to the Democratic Party and it comes to liberal America, right? And you see polls, the Pew studies that show that support is dropping within the Democratic and the more liberal circles. I think that within Israel even there was some thinking during the elections that it would be preferable for Israel if Hillary Clinton were to win, because there you would have, A, we don't know what Trump would be, he was an enigma, but B, with Clinton, you know what you're going to get. You know the people who are going to surround her. These are people who Israel has worked with before. Indyk, Ross, those types of people. But also you have a situation where you have an establishment candidate. Today, now that Hillary Clinton has lost, the Democratic Party is expected to even go more left-wing.
Right.
And as it goes farther left, it becomes more critical of Israel, and that bipartisan support will start to fall apart.
Right.
So I think that Israel also needs to consider how does it talk into all of these different demographics, and at the same time retain that. That's not going to be a simple task.
Right. Just one last topic I want to cover before we go to audience questions. This is the American Jewish anxiety about Trump is not going away, however friendly he seems to be to Israel and the Netanyahu government. Because omitting mention of Jews from the Holocaust Remembrance Statement and then defending it by saying that a lot of people suffered, which is something the Holocaust historians are now calling a form of denial, is just another example. And Netanyahu has called himself the leader of all Jews around the world, but he has not said anything about this. And his ambassador, your colleague, Ron Dermer, has praised Steve Bannon, who's emerged from this alt-right wing where a new sort of feeling of anti-Semitism is thriving in this country. When does Netanyahu say something about these statements and attitudes that are outraging and unsettling so many American Jews?
In the UN, we held a ceremony of remembrance for International Holocaust Day, and the US representative spoke very emotionally. And I think we don't need to be in a position now to enter internal fights here in the US, because we follow what's happening now.
But you have to say,
but I say it everywhere, that when we speak about the Holocaust, for sure the Jewish victims should be everywhere, in every statement. And I think it's agreed by everybody in Israel. But after saying that, I don't think it will be smart to drag Israel into the internal disputes that you have and you will continue to have here in the US. So yes, it's important to mention in every event, in every statement that you mention the Holocaust, the Jewish victims, period, but don't drag us to the arena that you
don't think that if the Obama White House had a similar statement and then telling the press that people are being petty about this, that Netanyahu wouldn't have something to say about this?
I don't think so. And whenever it comes to the Holocaust, I try not to get politics involved with these issues. So, and I don't recall that we did in the last 8 years got this issue involved with the administration.
But we also didn't have Steve Bannon in the White House with the alt-right and the anti-Semitic sort of baggage that brings with it. I mean, I think some people feel like they're in a bit of a twilight zone, that we have this happening. We have, JCCs being threatened with bombs, dozens of them in the last couple of weeks. We have just even yesterday on the subway in New York City, swastikas, which luckily people kindly helped clean up right there. But I mean, we have this sense of anxiety. And I think, as the protector of the Jewish people, as Netanyahu likes to position himself as, one could imagine sort of wanting to hear more. What would you say, Yaakov?
Well, look, I think that the ambassador's right that Israel will be careful not to find itself saying something that could disrupt or make those relations and turn them in a bad way at such an early stage. And I think, your question about Barack Obama is a good one. I asked the similar question, what would have happened had Barack Hussein Obama, right? Let's remember, omitted the Jews from a Holocaust statement so soon into his presidency. And I wonder if Netanyahu would have remained quiet at that time. And my personal belief is that he probably would have said something. Right. But I think that at this stage, it's still too early for Israel look, 8 years, Israel had a very bad relationship with the president, right? Now, there were good ties, right? The military ties exploded in a very good way. Intelligence cooperation, $38 billion. There's a lot to say thank you to. And there was a lot of cooperation, a lot of it that we don't know about. Right. But with that said, it was a very rocky, intense relationship. Israel now has the reset button has been hit, and there's an opportunity to have a new type of relationship. And I think the ambassador's right here that it's better to wait and to see how that progresses.
Thank you. Okay, so taking questions from the audience. We'll start with this one at the top of my pile. In regards to settlements, how is land negotiated with Palestinians living there?
Explanation?
Yeah. I guess we're talking about how is land, if Israel's land is being purchased there. I'm not clear from the question, but how is land negotiated with the Palestinians who are living there?
I mean, Israel as a state has negotiated for years with the Palestinian Authority, which is the designated representative of the Palestinian people. Two governments that negotiate one with another, just as would be expected between two different state entities, although this one's not yet a state.
Moving on to our next question. The Democratic Party is changing, moving further to the left. How will this, we've touched on this a little bit before, how will this affect bipartisan support for Israel? Anything you want to add to that?
I think we covered that.
Okay. Okay. It's said to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. How has the rise of Israel's military-industrial complex led to current and prevailing political situation? I'll start with you, Yaakov.
I think that on the one hand, we have today a situation where sometimes, and it's another criticism I have of the Netanyahu government at times, is that you go back to 2008. I was here in the United States covering the elections. And Barack Obama, as we all know, ran on a ticket of yes, we can, right? A ticket of hope, a campaign of hope. You look at the Israeli elections recently in 2015, and it was, if you elect Bougie Herzog, he will give away the country. This is what the Likud was saying. If the left comes to power, it will be the end of Israel. You had Bennett, who ran on a ticket, stop apologizing. We have nothing to say sorry for. So there was no hope that was given by the parties. It was all about what we can't do, not what we can do. And I think that when you look at Israel's current strategic standing in the Middle East today, we have a reality where we've never been stronger to some extent. Right? There's no, let's look around our borders. There's no existential threat today against the state of Israel. Iran, yes, still has ambitions to one day obtain a nuclear weapon, but they're not yet there.
Right.
And that would one day be an existential threat, but it's not there right now. The Iran deal has postponed that. Syria, its military is completely eroded today. You have no military that can invade Israel and conquer territory. And as bad as Hezbollah is, with its 130,000 rockets, and Hamas with its tens of thousands of rockets, they can terrorize, they can kill. Those tunnels can go into a kibbutz and massacre, but they can't even conquer a single kibbutz or moshav or a little town along the border. So when we look at that picture and we see that there's no real conventional military threat to Israel today, we have an amazing opportunity. We're in a position where we can do things that we weren't able to do before. We can potentially take risks for peace, as an example, that we weren't able to take before. So I think that when we look at this industrial military complex, this has given Israel a qualitative military edge. Now, the qualitative military edge, if you go back in time, was something that was recognized by our founding father, David Ben-Gurion, back already in 1948, where he recognized we'll never have as many soldiers as Egypt, we'll never have as many tanks as the Syrians, but we'll just have better ones. Ours will be better. And that better technology, that qualitative military edge is what is one of the main pillars that ensures Israel's survival. The question is though, so we're at this moment, what do we do with it?
Right.
And that's where we turn to the political echelon and we say, okay, so how do we take this forward? And that's where sometimes I feel that the creativity and the innovation that I read about in the book as an example, I don't always see that being translated into creativity and innovation when it comes to the political process. I mean, Ambassador Danon said very clearly, and I agree with him 100%, of why there is no peace process today. The fact that the Palestinians don't sit down and negotiate with us. But you had an administration that for 8 years tried to shove down our throats this concept of a two-state solution. I believe, personally, Palestinians should have their own state. Give them the independence, let's disengage. But if they don't want it, and for 20 years you've tried a model that doesn't work, right, because it's just not working, how come no one's thinking of something new, right? So it might be that we're at that moment now. If we're the startup nation, then we also have to use that to be the startup nation in terms of political process, diplomatic thinking, and beyond.
And you were known as a rebel within the Likud party before you came to the United Nations. Do you think your government is being bold enough to take the sort of the military advantage and be bold and be extra brave and think out of the box?
I have a different approach. Being a deputy minister of defense, I found out that today it's not about winning the war. In the past, when you heard about a war in Israel, people say, who will win the war? Today, we feel secure enough to say that we will win the wars, the future wars. It's about protecting the civilians, our civilians and the civilians of our enemies. When we talk about Hezbollah, it's the southern Lebanese. When we talk about Hamas, it's the Palestinians who live in Gaza. And the challenge is to win the war while you protect the civilian population in Israel and in southern Lebanon, for example. So I think for us, it is a challenge. And when we talk about technology, we do that. But still, it is a war. So when I speak at the Security Council and I bring aerial footage of villages in southern Lebanon, and I show it to my colleagues. You see this village of Raqqa in southern Lebanon. Over here, you see that's a hospital or a UN facility or a school, and you have a missile launcher of Hezbollah inside this building. So what will happen if we will have to attack this launcher eventually? The Security Council will call for an emergency meeting to condemn Israel. So the technology allows us to do more. And as I said, if somebody will try to hurt Israel, we will win. The question, what will be the price in the civilian population in Israel or in southern Lebanon in Gaza?
Thank you. Here's a question, which is an important one. I'm glad someone asked it. How do you envision engaging young liberal Jewish support for Israel? We know that not just Americans are tuning out in Israel, also young Jewish liberals are tuning out as well. So how does Israel re-engage, and what can they do as long as, for many liberal Jews, they look at this as an occupation, they look at this as an anathema to their own morals. How does Israel hit the restart button on that as well?
Well, I think it's very important to engage with everybody. I would recommend that they will come to Israel, first of all. Many people who criticize Israel, and I speak, I go to campuses, I will be in Colombia next week. I know, usually, I get the usual questions, usual protests, and most of the people who protest haven't been to Israel, but they know about the occupation, they know about everything. So I think bringing those people to Israel is very important, not only the ones that are already convinced, those who are confused, most of them, and they can do tikkun olam, they can do a lot of great things in Israel. They can volunteer, they can support Arab Israelis, they can do whatever they want, but if we'll get them to come to Israel, I think that will be our victory.
What about if they go to the West Bank?
They will find out that they can go and volunteer, and they will see how hard it is for them to go and actually be an American or to be liberal. If you are gay or you are a woman, if you try to actually volunteer, they will see how hard it is for them to be part of the West Bank or Gaza. So I think for us, the challenge is actually to get them to come and to do humanitarian work.
And as you know, there's been an amazing, upsurge in amount of young American Jews who have come through Birthright specifically and other programs. But is this on the radar of the Israeli government, the fact that they're losing a lot of American Jewish sort of heart and spirit? Where is that in the Israeli mindset, would you say?
You had a government decision that was taken in July of 2014, which allocated unprecedented money towards programming here in the United States and around the world towards two goals. One was strengthening Jewish identity. I mean, there's a crisis here in America. I mean, we can't ignore the fact that we can blame Israel, right? The so-called occupation, right? That is to blame for liberal American young Jews who aren't wanting to connect with Israel. But there's a crisis here when it comes to Jewish identity. People, whether we're looking at assimilation or intermarriage, or the fact, the Pew study of 2013 that spoke about how if you take out Orthodox Jews, you have 70% of Jews who are intermarrying. Right? And if you keep in the Orthodox Jews, which is just 10% of Jews in America, so it's about 600,000, you have a situation of where 50% are intermarrying. So you look down the line and you see a situation of where the Jewish community here is going to dwindle. Now, what can you do here? So Israel took money, and people will say it's patronizing, it's we don't want Israel telling us what to do. But on the other hand, it's a taking of responsibility by the Israeli government to say that we are partners, right? So money to strengthen Jewish identity, but also like programs through Birthright to enhance and bolster that connection with the state of Israel, which is just as important. And I think that, look, we're very imperfect, right? Like any country in the world. But I think that we get an unfair rap at times when we're looked at just through the prism of the conflict and the prism of the occupation. And when you have 500,000 Jews who have come, Jewish kids who have come to Israel through Birthright, they see a whole different story. Now, we have to tell a different narrative. That's true, and that's incumbent upon us in the state of Israel, is to tell a new story. I think that, I look at my parents' generation, of children of immigrants, children of Holocaust survivors who came to this country and believed and saw in Israel a story of David or Goliath, right? So a story of a miracle, right? That doesn't talk to young kids today. They take Israel for granted. So how can we connect them with the country? And that's complicated, right? But it's not just Israel. It's also the American Jewish community, which also needs to take action to engage their people in Israel's story. They have just as much responsibility, I think.
I think they get scared off because it's complicated and it's confusing and it feels dark sometimes. I mean, so there's also, and I think there's also a dismissiveness of American Jewish community, like assimilation, but there's a lot of thriving social justice and people who are really, there's a lot of good things that are happening in the American Jewish community as well. And I think there's a resentment sometimes that Israeli Jews look down upon the pluralism here. I mean, a lot of American Jews don't feel like they have a place in Israel today, right? They feel like they have a ruling religious elite that looks at them as heretics. It doesn't let Jewish American women or women at all pray at the Western Wall. So, I mean, does that resonate with the Israeli government too? That this sort of the religious pluralism is very important to Jews?
It is very important for the government. I know that when I was a minister, we discussed it a lot. It is important. And I still think that, you need to bring the people to Israel. Because when you come to Israel, we speak with Israelis, they appreciate the support of the Jewish community. They love to see the birthright buses traveling all over Israel. And we understand it's a bond that we should work together to keep it as strong as it is and even make it stronger. But I think when you are here and you attack Israel and you blame Israel for everything, and we also see that people tend to blame what's happening in Israel for everything.
But sometimes in the American Jewish community, there's a lot of pushback against anything that's considered negative towards Israel, where in Israel there can be a much more vibrant debate about what's going on inside Israel, which I think is sort of one of the ironies here. Here's another question, one of our last questions. What is post-Bibi? Which is an interesting question. We have Netanyahu currently facing 2 criminal probes. Yaakov, can you fill us in a little bit on that and sort of what might be next?
Well, I mean, there are currently 2 or 3 or 4, maybe at this stage already, different investigations or reviews of different things when it comes to Prime Minister Netanyahu. It doesn't look too good from what I know and what's being reported in Israel. And it could be that this might lead to a charges being brought against the Prime Minister, which is then questionable exactly what the process would be. Does he have to step down? Can he remain in power? And in the Prime Minister's seat as he's indicted, there's not exactly 100% clarity. It seems that he would be able to remain and he wouldn't have to step down. It's a question if a member of his coalition would threaten to pull out and bring him down if he doesn't resign, and then what would happen if he does resign. But when it comes to the post-Bibi scenario, the ambassador will be upset at me, but I'll say that one of the potential successors to the Prime Minister is Ambassador Danon as well, right, who comes from the Likud party. So there's the I'm sorry.
Can we ask you then first? Excuse me.
No, he's an ambassador. He has to be a diplomat through and through. But I think that, look, there will be a bloodbath within the Likud the day after Netanyahu. Who succeeds him? Who leads the Likud party? The Israeli public today are on the right. I don't see how they vote for a left-wing candidate. I don't see how that happens. Israeli voters, Israel's disenchanted, right? Someone has to tell them and convince them that peace is in their interest, that peace can be achieved. And you have Yair Lapid, you have Bennett, you have all these other guys who are out there kind of waiting for Netanyahu to go. But I wouldn't write him off so quickly. He's shown a tenacity that you do not see among many leaders around the world. And he tells us that he'll be here for a long time. But I think that within Likud, you have a lot of different people. One of them is Danon, is Ambassador Danon, sorry. One of them is, there's Gilad Erdan, there's Bogi Ya'alon, the former defense minister might come back. There are other people. But it will be interesting, as it always is.
Anything you want to add?
I would recommend everybody to wait. We do not have a term limit in Israel yet. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is very active, very strong. And I speak with him a lot. I look at his schedule of this week. So he flew to London, coming back to Israel. He's flying to Washington, flying back to Israel, flying to Australia. Singapore, then flying back to Israel, and handling all the issues. And in Israel, we are a strong democracy. And I think we are not very happy to read everything that you write, the reporters. but the fact that ministers and even the Prime Minister of Israel is under investigation, it shows the strength of our democracy. And when you look at the map, can you imagine the same articles in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi, you name it. You will not find even one country in the Middle East that can be very proud in our democracy.
Thank you. Another audience question. What new technologies is Israel developing that may change non-military life?
Non-military life. Look, I think as Ambassador Danon mentioned, desalination, for example. We have a number of desalination plants in Israel today. We recycle water in a way that's not done anywhere else around the world, right? And you look at the different types of technologies that Israel makes when it comes to water technology, when it comes to medical devices, right? Technology like Rewalk, which allows paraplegics to walk again, right? Body suits, like a skeleton suit that you can actually walk. You look at stents, right, for hearts, that Israel's leading the way in that type of technology. So, and I mean, not to mention just high tech, right? We had just a record investments in VCs in Israel just this past quarter. You look at exits over the last year, different companies like Waze being sold to Google for $1 billion. I mean, it's blowing out of proportion. I think, though, when you look at that, though, we have to keep in mind is that in Israel you have almost 2 economies. You have that high-tech bubble, which does great, pays great salaries, is mostly in the center of the country. But you have, when you look at the traditional economy, more regular, old-fashioned industry, it's not climbing and increasing in the same way as we see in the tech sphere. So it's something that Israel needs to work on. And by the way, they are when it comes to integrating Haredim, ultra-Orthodox men into the workforce. Israeli Arab women, right? You have among Arab men, you have about 75% work participation. But among Israeli Arab women, you only have about 23, 24%. So getting more Israeli Arab women involved. And there's a lot of effort being done by the state to try to improve that, because these are two untapped resources of talent that we can bring into the workforce.
Right. Do you have any, from your time serving as technology minister, any favorite technologies?
Well, in terms of most of the world, which is not includes New York and Tel Aviv, it's sustainability. It's food and water. That's what the world needs. And I think Israel will continue to lead on those two issues of developing new forms of food and desalination technology. And in terms of like high tech, you know, and you write a little bit about it in the book, I would say nano satellites. You know, we speak a lot about drones, but you know, nano satellites, today you have a very tiny light satellites that are being developed in Israel. And I think in the future, we will see thousands of them circling above, and we will be using them. It's not there yet, but I think in 10, 15 years, that will be the new thing coming from Israel.
Right.
By the way, when you look at the technology that Israel excels at, as the ambassador mentioned, we don't make big things, right? We don't, you know, there was the adventure with the Lavi fighter aircraft back in the 1980s, and then that was shut down. But where do we excel? We excel, like our satellites are called mini satellites, right? They weigh about 300, 400 kilograms as opposed to 25 tons, which are these mammoth satellites that they make here in the United States. We specialize in drones. We don't make fighter jets, right? We specialize in sensors, such as like the cameras that you're going to put on the satellite that can see this cup from all the way up in space, as an example. And we specialize in making these nano satellites. So we can do, Israel is an expert at making the small things that you would need, but not necessarily those big platforms.
Right. So that wraps up our questions from the audience, but I just would be remiss if I had the two of you in the room and didn't talk about two more things just quickly, if that's okay, which is Iran and the Iranian nuclear deal, and also the question of the US Embassy move to Jerusalem. So maybe to start with Iran briefly. You know, it seems that in Israel, obviously there was a great opposition to the deal, but it seems like the Trump White House is pushing forward with the Iran deal. Is that going to be, how is that going to stand with the Israelis? Is this idea that being vigilant about Iran, is that going to be enough for the Israelis? What do you sort of expect on that front?
Our position was very clear. We thought it was a bad deal. We still think it is a bad deal, but let's at least enforce this bad deal. And it's not happening. So I think the first issue will be about enforcing the sanctions. We see what's happening with Iran. They continue with the ballistic missile test. They even write on the missile, we need to wipe Israel off the map. So, and beside the tests, you should look at the money they give to Yemen, the money they're giving to Hezbollah, and even to the Hamas. They don't care if they're Shia, Sunni, as long as they create instability, the Iranian will support it. So for us, it's important, and I think it is about time to start to speak about applying new sanctions. And I think that one will be one of the issues that the Prime Minister will discuss with the President, is about enforcing the deal, and let's start talking about new sanctions.
Just quickly, Trump, of course, has these unusually close ties with Russia, one could say. The Russians have always been quite friendly towards the Iranians. Is that of some concern to the government from what you're hearing?
Well, you know, it's in diplomacy, in international relations, it's never easy. You always have interest and pressures, but we have to look at our interests. And I think today it's not only about Israel. I was in Dubai a few months ago, and I can share with you that many leaders in the Middle East care a lot about the issue of Iran. So I was by the way in the hotel when President Trump met King Abdullah last Thursday. It was a national prayer breakfast.
Right.
So before he spoke, the president met in a side room. I'm sure the issue of Iran was one of the talking points, because when we speak about what the moderate Arab countries care today, they care more about what's happening in Iran than anything else.
I want just a quick story just on that note. A few months ago, and we wrote this in the paper, a few months ago, one of the Gulf states, right? You have some of the Gulf states are fighting right now in Yemen, right, against the Houthis, which are being supported by Iran. And one of the Gulf states had intelligence of a ship that was going to be setting sail from Iran to arm the Houthis in Yemen. They called up the Americans, passed on the information. Day goes by, 2 days go by, nothing happens. Then they pass on the intelligence to Israel. Within a day, that ship turned around and went back to Iran. So you see today the amazing close cooperation that goes on behind the scenes, right, between Israel and these Gulf states, the Saudis and Abu Dhabi, Dubai, the UAE, which they don't talk about, right? I wish they would, but it'd be a very great story. But they don't talk about, but it shows the main, I think, what's bringing them close together today is this common enemy, which is the understanding. For years, everyone used to talk about how Israel is the source of all instability. It's our conflict with the Palestinians. If we just solved the Palestinian problem, there would be, stability in Egypt, and there would be stability in Jordan, and there would no longer be Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I think what we've all seen in recent years with the so-called Arab Spring is that it's got nothing to do with us, right? And everyone understands that the main provocateur is, in fact, Iran. And they're the ones who behind the scenes are pulling the strings, funding all of these different terrorist organizations, which have one goal, which is to create instability throughout the region.
Speaking of potential instability, just my last question, the potential move of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, there's a sense that it could set off quite a firestorm and some instability. Who is clamoring for it, if anyone is clamoring for it, either in the Israeli government or how do you see this playing out, especially with the new American ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, who said he wants to make this happen?
Our position is very clear. Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, period. David Ben-Gurion was the one leading to that important decision. It is the capital of the Jewish people, also, period. So we will welcome the move of the embassy. I'm sure if the U.S. will take that decision, we will see other countries that will follow the U.S. It's an American decision. But we will welcome it.
Will you push for it as well?
We say it publicly, we will welcome it. And when you hear all the threats, in Israel we don't run our policy according to threats coming from different groups. Because always when David Ben-Gurion was considering to move the Knesset from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, he got a phone call from the State Department asking him not to do it. They told him it will be a problem, there will be riots, it will be dangerous. You know what he did? The next morning, he moved the Knesset from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So, and we see today the reality. So that's the way we handle our policy, but it is an American decision, and we will welcome the day that the embassy will move to Jerusalem.
So Yaakov, just following up on that, Jerusalem is one of the final status issues that's supposed to be negotiated. And so some might interpret this as Israel getting a concession without having to do anything. Is this worth the risk, do you think, for Israel to have the embassy move? Or where do you sort of see it right now? Because Trump seems to have been backing away from it.
Look, personally, I'm conflicted. Because on the one hand, it's symbolic, right? What does it really mean? The embassy's in Tel Aviv, the embassy's in Jerusalem. We're called the Jerusalem Post, so it'll just be easier for us to deliver the paper if it's in Jerusalem. But I think at the end of the day, does that really mean anything? And also you have to consider the fact, so he gives you the embassy in Jerusalem, but what does he ask for in exchange, right? Trump has proven to be very transactional, not just in business, but also in the way he runs foreign policy. So he wouldn't just give you something for free, right? He'd expect something in return, and I think there we need to be a little wary. With that said, personally, it's absurd, right? Jerusalem has been our capital for just about 3,000 years, give or take. It's the place that Jews have prayed for and at for those thousands of years. And so don't build in East Jerusalem, that we can completely understand. But there also, at times, I think some of these countries need to make decisions. And it's not just America, it's also, take the European Union, just as an example. So they label all products made outside of the 1967 lines, right? So recently I was sitting with a group of ambassadors from Europe, and I said, so who should we give, also the Golan, right? What should we do with the Golan today? We should give it to Assad, we should give it to Al-Qaeda, we should give it to ISIS. You can't just be right, you also gotta be smart. And I think that unfortunately sometimes in the world, we don't see that smartness.
Right, amen. Well, thank you so much for both.
Thank you. Thank you, Dina.